This entire section is all about complex state management. There are various ways like Context API or Redux to deal with state when you want it to be global or flexible across various components or an entire application. Generally, you may have some data or maybe bunch of data which you want to share across various components or the entire application. Let us illustrate prop drilling here. For example, you have a login component where when the user enters the credentials, the user is validated, the authentication is done, and then it stores the data of valid user and authentication. Now, once it is authenticated, it opens the dashboard, and then there are various other components in the application. Let's say there is a user details component. When somebody clicks on the details component, for example, it opens the user profile. So in case when you want that the user data that is valid, let's say you need that data here at different components. Maybe you need in this user profile, or you may need, let's say, at the very last component here. For example, you want to refer this data to this component 3. Then you will have to pass this data from login to dashboard as props, maybe dashboard to component 2 as props, and component 2 to component 3 as props. In short, whenever you see that there are different levels, or maybe you want that the data should be available to all the components, you are going to pass it through props only. So it goes from component to component. Sometimes it happens that you may have sibling components like this. Then also you will have dashboard in between, which passes the data as props to these two components also. Passing the data from component to component as props is basically called as the prop drilling. You have to keep on passing the data at different levels. In all these cases, the issue is that it becomes really difficult to handle these states at different level. And to solve this complex scenario, we can use the Context API, Redux, or even similar framework to make the required state values global. So it goes something like this, where you have Context API or maybe some way where this state becomes global and it is directly accessible to this component 3. So n level of component can access, or any component can access these values directly. So in this entire Context API section, we will be diving deep into the whole concept how the Context API works with an example, whereas for Redux we will be learning it in forthcoming sections. I will not compare Context API and Redux at the moment, as first we need to understand very clearly how both Context API and Redux work. Once we are done with both in different sections, at the end of Redux we will have a comparative discussion on Context API versus Redux. Now let's talk about relative questions. The first question is, what is prop drilling? So we have seen that here we have the state where you have the user details, you have the login component, and when this component 3 needs the data, for example the user data, then it is going to traverse through these components as props. So this is how the prop drilling works. The second question is it always good to avoid prop drilling pattern? That is, should you put the global state all the time using Context API or maybe Redux? Well, this is a very relative discussion, but I must say you don't generally prefer to make everything global. Whenever you have state which is used for the local component, or let's say at 1 or maybe 2 level of component, you try to prefer that you pass it through props. But you will always find some pieces of data which is shared across the application. So generally you try to make only those things global which is shared among various components. Otherwise, prop drilling is not a bad approach, but yes, when it is getting complex with various levels, more levels, then certainly you can choose to make few data pieces global.